After the conclusion of the campaign against the Helvetii, which took place in 58 BC, the political and military situation in Gaul was not at all stable. The tribes who had witnessed the advance of the Helvetian masses and the subsequent victory of the Roman legions were impressed by Caesar's organizational ability, but at the same time fearful of Rome's growing weight in the region. Caesar himself, in his De Bello Gallico, observes that the subjugation of the Helvetii and the redistribution of the survivors in their original territories had a double effect. On the one hand, it consolidated the Roman position as a protective power of some peoples. On the other, it increased the distrust of the neighboring tribes who feared an increasingly marked intrusion into their autonomy. Before his arrival, Gaul was a land divided into multiple political entities, without unified coordination, with changing alliances and frequent internal conflicts. The victory against the Helvetii had clearly shown that a disciplined army, led by an experienced commander and equipped with superior logistical and technical tools, could inflict serious defeats on much larger populations. However, despite the strength demonstrated, the Gauls did not give up on the idea of Roman rule, and it was precisely in this context that the new threat represented by the Belgian coalition emerged. Caesar, writing in Book 2 of De Bello Gallico, states that after the initial success he received information from various Gallic peoples about the formation of a vast alliance between the Belgi, inhabitants of the northern regions, and other tribes who feared the Roman advance. He describes the Belgi as the most courageous and warlike group among the Gauls, motivating this characteristic with a cultural and material distance from the Mediterranean and the Roman province, and with the frequent conflicts they had with the Germans settled beyond the Rhine. This description, although with an obvious propagandistic intent, reflected a reality. The Belgic tribes had maintained a military organization based on collective mobilization and the support of their communities, and were able to gather very large contingents. In terms of reputation, they represented a serious threat, different from that of the Helvetii, who had been a migrant people in search of new lands, while the Belgians defended their very political and territorial existence. The state of the campaign in Gaul on the eve of the clash near the Axona River cannot be understood without considering the perception that the Romans had of the territory. Caesar did not limit himself to conceiving Gaul as a unitary region, but divided it into three large ethnic and cultural areas: the Gauls proper, the Belgians, and the Aquitanians. This division, presented at the beginning of De Bello Gallico, has the aim of giving the Roman reader an orderly and rational picture, although in reality the boundaries were more nuanced and complex. The campaign of 57 BC against the Belgians is therefore the second great act of the war, immediately following the resolution of the Swiss question and the containment of tensions with the Germans led by Ariovistus. Caesar's political plan was clear: to consolidate Roman dominion over all of Gaul before any tribal alliances could become an insurmountable obstacle. A central element of the state of the countryside was the perception that the Gauls themselves had of Rome. Many people saw Roman power as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it could guarantee security against aggressive neighbors; on the other, it risked turning into a form of subjection. The Aedui, for example, ancient allies of Rome, had benefited from Caesar's intervention against the Helvetii, but their political influence was reduced as Caesar directly imposed his authority. Likewise, the Remi, who took the side of the Romans during the campaign of 57 BC, were driven to this choice not only by conviction, but also by the fear of being overwhelmed by the Belgian coalition. Caesar often underlines the role of his Gallic allies as a source of strategic and logistical information, but their participation should also be read as a form of political opportunism, typical of a fragmented land marked by internal rivalries. From a geographical and logistical point of view, Gaul represented a challenge for the Roman army. The distances, the lack of road infrastructure comparable to those of Italy or the province of Narbonense, and the need to supply an army of tens of thousands of men constituted problems of the first order. Caesar himself dedicates ample space in his story to underlining the speed with which he managed to move the legions, attributing much of his successes to this characteristic. The state of the campaign at that time can therefore be described as a precarious balance. On one side, a determined Roman commander, with trained troops and advanced military engineering tools. On the other, a hostile territory, with large populations, motivated by fear and pride, and ready to unite to counter external influence. The information Caesar received about the state of the Belgi came largely from the Remi, who decided to send ambassadors to the Roman camp to declare their loyalty and ask for protection. In this context, the character of the campaign clearly emerges: not only open war, but also diplomacy, propaganda, and alliance building. Caesar himself, in De Bello Gallico, carefully describes the declaration of the Remi, who stated that they were ready to provide hostages and collaborate in any way, as long as Rome defended them from the danger represented by their more powerful neighbors. This episode shows how the campaign in Gaul was not only a succession of battles, but also a slow process of integration of some tribes into the Roman power system, obtained through promises of security and immediate advantages. The state of the campaign was also conditioned by public opinion in Rome. News from Gaul was spread with great rapidity, and the Senate followed the proconsul's progress carefully. Caesar needed military successes to strengthen his political position, and each victory consolidated his image as an invincible general. Therefore, the representation of the state of the campaign in Bello Gallico is never neutral, but constantly oriented towards underlining his readiness, his ability to predict enemy moves, and the discipline of his legions. At the same time, it is important to recognize that other non-Roman sources have not reached us, and this limits the possibility of reconstructing the state of Gaul in that period in a fully balanced way. However, through the same Caesarian text, one can read between the lines the level of resistance and fear that the local populations had towards Roman power. The overall picture of the campaign immediately preceding the Battle of the Axona River is therefore that of a region marked by tensions, where Caesar sought to transform his military position into political dominance, and where the Belgians appeared as the last great force capable of countering Roman expansion. The balance of power was fragile, and the clash that would occur in 57 BC would be decisive in determining whether Rome could assert its control over the whole of Gaul or whether it would be forced into a long conflict of attrition. When Caesar received news of the formation of the Belgian coalition in 57 BC, his attention was captured not only by the large number of peoples involved, but also by the novelty of their alliance. The Belgians had never before been described as a unitary bloc, and their political identity was fragmented into numerous tribes with shifting boundaries and often divergent interests. In Bello Gallico, Caesar precisely reports the list of peoples who had united to oppose Rome, also specifying the number of warriors that each had promised to provide. The sum, although probably exaggerated for propaganda reasons, reached the figure of around 300,000 men. This data, although difficult to accept as realistic in the strict sense, shows how the Roman general intended to communicate the gravity of the threat to Rome and the Senate, presenting his campaign not as a war against individual local tribes, but as a conflict against a vast confederation of warrior peoples. The Belgians occupied the northern regions of Gaul, corresponding roughly to today's Belgium, northern France, and part of the Netherlands. They lived in a territory characterized by dense forests, wide plains, and a network of rivers that made mobility complex, but at the same time offered a natural defensive resource. Caesar describes them as the most distant from the Mediterranean culture and from trade with the Roman and southern Gallic merchants, underlining how their harshness was the result of a hostile environment and frequent conflicts with the Germans settled beyond the Rhine. Contact with Germanic populations had contributed to accentuating their reputation as ferocious fighters, not inclined to formal discipline but skilled in ambushes, rapid assaults, and forms of irregular warfare. It is no coincidence that the Roman general himself points out that their strength derived not only from their number, but from constant military practice, made necessary by living in a border region. There were many Belgian tribes, and among these the Suetians, the Bellovaci, the Nervi, the Achuatusi, the Menapi, and the Morini stood out in terms of importance. The Suetians, located in the area corresponding to Picardy, were led by a king named Galba, who according to Caesar enjoyed great authority over a good part of the Belgians. They could boast relations with the Britons across the Channel, thanks to the sea routes that connected northern Gaul with the British Isles. The Bellovaci were known for their wealth and ability to raise a massive army. The Nervians, on the other hand, stood out for their radical aversion towards external influences, to the point that, as Caesar recalls, they did not allow merchants to enter their territories and refused any type of luxury, for fear that this could weaken their warrior spirit. This detail, reported in Bello Gallico, has a propaganda value but at the same time provides an evocative picture of a society that intended to preserve its identity through the refusal of economic and cultural contact. The Belgian coalition was, however, far from monolithic. Caesar himself observes that the tribes, although united against Rome, were often divided by particular interests and historical rivalries. Some peoples, such as the Remi, preferred not to join the confederation, both for fear of being crushed by more powerful neighbors and for opportunistic considerations that pushed them to seek Roman support. The Remi's decision to deliver hostages and ask Caesar for protection represents a key episode, because it shows how the unity of the Belgians was fragile and permeable. Not everyone was willing to sacrifice their autonomy for a common cause, and the fear of suffering Roman repression after a possible defeat weakened the alliance. The analysis of the Belgian forces reveals that their strengths lay above all in the ability to quickly mobilize large masses of warriors, supported by local communities, who provided food and shelter. Furthermore, They knew the territory in depth and could exploit the rivers, woods, and marshy lands to slow down the Roman advance. Another important element was morale. Many Belgian people saw the war against Rome not just as a political defense, but as a real struggle for survival, aware that submission would lead to the loss of their social structures and their independence. However, their limitations were equally evident. They lacked a unified and stable chain of command, and strategic decisions depended on tribal councils or temporary leaders chosen for the occasion. While this type of organization favored popular mobilization, on the other it made it difficult to maintain cohesion during prolonged campaigns, especially in the presence of defeats or logistical difficulties. The Belgian military tradition was based on techniques different from the Roman ones. Their forces were composed largely of light infantry, accustomed to moving quickly and striking in sudden assaults. They used oval shields, spears, short swords, and in some cases war chariots, although in smaller numbers than other Celtic populations. Cavalry played a significant role, especially in skirmishes and reconnaissance, and were often supported by light tanks capable of transporting warriors and supplies. Caesar describes them as courageous fighters but inclined to impetus rather than discipline, which made them fearsome in initial clashes but vulnerable in long-lasting battles against legions accustomed to endurance and resistance. Some indirect sources, such as Strabo in his geography written in the 1st century BC, confirmed the image of a warlike people and less inclined to trade compared to the southern Gauls. Even Tacitus, in Germany in the 1st century AD, although not speaking directly about the Belgians of the Caesarian period, reflected on the characteristics of the border populations who lived between Gaul and Germany, underlining the harshness of customs and the constant exposure to conflict. These references help to understand that the representation of Caesar was not completely isolated, but inserted into a broader perception that the Roman world had of the populations of the north. The causes of the mobilization against Rome were multiple. On the one hand, there was the fear that, after the subjugation of the Helvetii and the victory over Ariovistus in 58 BC, Caesar intended to extend his influence over the whole of Gaul. On the other hand, there was pride and the desire to maintain political independence. Caesarian propaganda emphasized the bellicosity of the Belgians, but it is probable that many peoples were moved more by the fear of losing their local privileges than by a united project of resistance. The alliance was therefore born as a defensive response, driven by urgency, rather than as a long-term organic plan. The numerical strength of the Belgians represented, at least on paper, a considerable challenge for the Roman legions. Caesar could count on around 8 legions, supplemented by allied Gallic cavalry, for a total of no more than 50,000 men. The comparison with a mass of over 200,000 enemies, even reducing the figures provided by the sources, showed an apparently unfavorable balance of forces. However, the territorial dispersion of the Belgians and the difficulty of maintaining such a large army under a single leader for a long time worked in Rome's favor. Caesar immediately understood that the best strategy would be to exploit the lack of cohesion between the tribes, isolating the weakest peoples and trying to break the alliance with targeted attacks and by building relationships of loyalty with the Remi and other allies. The state of Rome's enemies on the eve of the Battle of the Axona River was therefore characterized by a duplicity. On the one hand, the potential strength of a vast coalition, motivated and rooted in a territory difficult to penetrate, on the other the political and strategic fragility of an alliance born more from fear than from a shared project. The Belgians could count on individual courage, knowledge of the terrain, and impressive numbers, but they were penalized by the absence of a unified direction, by the difficulty of maintaining supplies for such a large army, and by the impossibility of matching the logistical and engineering efficiency of the Romans. It is in this context that the meaning of the clash that would have occurred along the Axona is fully understood. It was not just a battle between two armies, but the Belgians' attempt to assert their political existence in the face of an expansionist power, and at the same time the opportunity for Caesar to demonstrate that discipline, logistics, and strategic capacity could prevail over brute force and numbers. The state of the Roman army at the time of the campaign against the Belgians in 57 BC constitutes a fundamental element for understanding not only the progress of the operations but also the profound reasons for Caesar's success. After the victory over the Helvetii and the containment of Ariovistus' threat in 58 BC, the legions had accumulated direct experience in hostile environments, facing long marches, pitched battles and supply problems in territories not yet integrated into the Roman logistical networks. Caesar himself, in Bello Gallico, underlines that at the time of moving against the Belgians, he had 8 effective legions under his command, to which were added contingents of cavalry provided by the Gallic allies, in particular the Aedui and the Remi, and a certain number of light troops coming from local populations. The overall strength of his army did not exceed 50,000 men, a figure that appears limited when compared with the numbers boasted by the enemies, but which stood out for its discipline, training, and ability to maneuver. The internal structure of the legions was organized according to consolidated patterns, the result of an evolution that dated back to at least the 2nd century BC, but which reached a new efficiency under Caesar. Each legion was made up of approximately 4,800 soldiers divided into 10 cohorts, each of which included 3 groups of 2 centuries each. The centuria, led by a centurion, represented the fundamental cell of the legion and constituted the most cohesive operational unit. The role of the centurions, repeatedly mentioned by Caesar in his works, was crucial. They guaranteed discipline, motivated the soldiers, and made quick decisions in battle. The fact that many of them came from plebeian families or veteran soldiers increased their authority in the eyes of the troops. An important aspect was logistics. Caesar placed great emphasis on the ability to supply the legions in territories far from the Roman bases. The communication routes along the rivers, such as the Axona itself, were used not only as defensive barriers but also as channels for the transport of food, weapons, and building materials. Military engineers, the so-called blacksmiths, guaranteed the construction of bridges, fortifications, and entrenched camps, elements that transformed the Roman army into not only an offensive but also a defensive force. The practice of erecting a fortified camp every evening, described in several places by Caesar, is emblematic of the Roman military mentality. It was not just a precautionary measure, but a real disciplinary habit that kept the army in a constant state of readiness. Pure Roman cavalry was numerically small, and Caesar relied heavily on contingents provided by his Gallic allies. This element, explicitly mentioned in Bello Gallico, shows the composite nature of his forces. Gallic cavalry, although less disciplined than the legions, were invaluable in reconnaissance, skirmishes, and pursuits. Likewise, slingers and archers from Iberian and Balearic populations, when available, completed the military structure with ranged offensive capabilities that the Romans tended to underestimate compared to the value of heavy infantry. Troop morale in 57 BC was relatively high. After 2 consecutive victorious campaigns, the soldiers had gained confidence in their commander's abilities. Caesar, according to what Sallust testifies in a fragment of his works and according to what emerges from the proconsul's own words, knew how to maintain a direct relationship with the troops, often calling the soldiers by name and sharing with them the difficulties of the march and in the field. The promise of loot and future lands represented a further incentive, since many legionaries were farmers without large properties, driven to seek military service to improve their social condition. From the point of view of combat techniques, Caesar's legions were equipped with standardized weapons. The pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend after impact and make the opponent's shield unusable, the gladius hispaniensis, a short sword effective in close combat, and the scutum, a large rectangular shield that offered protection and allowed the cohesion of the line to be maintained. This combination of weapons, together with the tight formation, gave the Romans a clear advantage in pitched battles, especially against opponents who relied on the initial impetus and individualism of the warriors. Caesar insists several times, in Bello Gallico, on the ability of his troops to maintain order even in the most critical moments, implicitly underlining the difference with the Gallic and Belgian forces which tended to disperse after the first clashes. No less relevant was the chain of command. Caesar had trusted legates, chosen from senators and knights close to him politically, such as Titus Labienus, who would play an essential role during the entire Gallic campaign. These legates had the authority to lead portions of the army in autonomous operations, allowing for some strategic flexibility. Alongside the legates, there were the military tribunes, young people belonging to the Roman nobility who accumulated command experience, and the prefects of the allies, responsible for the non-legionary troops. The combination of experience, discipline, and hierarchical structure allowed Caesar to react quickly to sudden situations, exploiting enemy divisions or consolidating defensive positions with extreme effectiveness. A further element to consider is the adaptability of the Roman army. In the campaign against the Belgians, Caesar had to face an enemy who was numerically superior and lacked an easily identifiable political center. In this context, the tactical flexibility of the legions proved decisive. The use of mobile fortifications, the construction of embankments and palisades to defend bridges and fields, and the readiness to conduct targeted sorties against the besiegers demonstrate a capacity for innovation that did not belong to the adversaries. Caesar did not limit himself to applying pre-existing schemes, but adapted Roman techniques to the concrete situation from time to time. Discipline was maintained not only through training, but also through a severe system of rewards and punishments. Rewards included public praise, symbolic gifts such as crowns and torques, and mention in official reports. Punishments could be harsh, reaching the point of decimation in extreme cases of collective disobedience, although Caesar was known to prefer solutions that preserved the numerical strength of the legions. His ability to balance rigor and clemency contributed to consolidating the relationship of trust with the troops. Later sources, such as Frontinus in his Stratagemata of the 1st century AD, report various examples of military cunning attributed to Caesar during the Gallic campaign, confirming the perception that the general did not rely only on brute force but on the combination of discipline and tactical intelligence. This trait was made possible by the very state of his army, conceived as a flexible instrument, capable of defending, attacking and above all resisting prolonged pressure. From an economic point of view, maintaining 8 legions in Gaul entailed considerable costs. The salaries of the legionaries, the supply of food, the construction of military infrastructures and logistical expenses were supported partly by the spoils of war and partly by the taxes of the Narbonense province and by the extraordinary contributions imposed on the subjugated populations. This financial mechanism was fragile but effective in the short term. The war was self-financing with its results, and this reinforced the need for continued success. Any setback could have generated supply difficulties and undermined the loyalty of the allies. Caesar's Roman army was therefore not just a military machine, but a political and social microcosm. Soldiers from different regions of Italy, senatorial officers, Gallic auxiliaries, and foreign mercenaries coexisted inside it. This heterogeneity, which could have turned into a factor of instability, was instead managed through a common culture, based on the sense of belonging to the legion and the personal charisma of the commander. Caesar, with his dry and direct writing, always tries to convey the idea that success did not derive from chance, but from the organization and discipline of his troops. In summary, the state of the Roman army on the eve of the Battle of the Axona River can be defined as solid, experienced and motivated, despite the numerical inferiority compared to the enemies. The combination of logistics, discipline, adaptability and leadership was an advantage that no tribal coalition could match. It is in this context that we understand why, despite being faced with an apparently overwhelming force, Caesar did not hesitate to deploy his legions and face the challenge, aware that the quality of his army would compensate for any quantitative disadvantage. After having consolidated his positions with his allies and having assessed the size of the Belgian coalition, Caesar found himself in need of carefully preparing the campaign that would lead to the clash along the Axona in 57 BC. The preparation for the battle was not a sudden event, but a gradual process in which the collection of information, the logistical evaluation, the choice of terrain, and the construction of defensive devices that would have guaranteed the Roman legions a tactical advantage over a numerically superior enemy converged. In De Bello Gallico, the Roman general describes the first movements of his troops and the decision to advance quickly towards the territory of the Remi, the allies who had asked for protection. Their loyalty constituted a decisive test. If Caesar had managed to defend them and prevent the destruction of their cities, he would have strengthened the image of Rome as a reliable and protective power. The information gathered by the Remi was crucial in the preparatory phase. They reported to Caesar the names of the combined tribes, the estimated numbers of the contingents, and above all the directions from which the different populations would arrive. This data allowed the Roman commander to anticipate enemy movements and evaluate the most exposed points. The choice to locate the camp near the Axona River was not accidental. This waterway represented both a natural barrier against possible assaults and a useful communication route for supplies. Caesar ordered the construction of a bridge to maintain a constant connection with the opposite bank, where he could guarantee the safety of the Remi and their villages. The defense of the bridge became a priority from the beginning, so much so that he entrusted Tito Labieno, one of his most trusted legates, with the task of guarding the structures and intervening in the event of an attack. The organization of the Roman camp followed standardized schemes but adapted to the terrain. Each camp was surrounded by ditches and earthworks, reinforced by palisades, which made any sudden assault difficult. This practice, described by Caesar and confirmed by later authors such as Hyginus Grammaticus in his treatises on military art from the 1st century AD, was the result of a deep-rooted habit that transformed every camp into a mobile fortress. In the specific case of the Axona, the camp was arranged so as to have the river protecting one side, with the bridge as a vital element for communications. This arrangement allowed the legions to deploy quickly in the event of a pitched battle, but also to retreat safely within the fortifications. During the days preceding the clash, numerous skirmishes occurred between the allied cavalry of the Romans and that of the Belgians. Caesar reports that on several occasions the light troops of the Remi, supported by the Aedui knights, had to face enemy units that tried to devastate the surrounding fields to weaken the morale of the Allies. These minor clashes, although not decisive, contributed to defining the perception of the Roman strength. The speed of reactions, the organization of patrols, and the ability to maintain supply lines prevented the Belgians from achieving immediate successes. For Caesar, every day that passed without suffering a defeat represented an advantage, since the enemy coalition, so numerous, could not sustain itself for long far from its own lands without running into supply difficulties. Another aspect of the preparation concerned diplomacy. While the legions fortified the camp, Caesar constantly received ambassadors from undecided or neutral peoples. Some, like the Atrebates, hesitated for a long time before openly committing themselves against Rome, aware that a defeat would expose them to harsh reprisals. Others sought to maintain ambiguous relations, offering promises of support to the Belgians, but at the same time sending secret messages to Caesar to probe his intentions. These episodes, although secondary on a military level, influenced the strategic preparation. The general knew that he would not have to face all the enemies at the same time, and that it was enough to hit a few weak points to make the entire alliance falter. The psychological factor had a significant weight. The Belgians had gathered in large numbers and wanted to show their strength with spectacular assaults and devastation of Remi villages, in an attempt to intimidate both Rome's allies and the legions themselves. Caesar, however, adopted a prudent but resolute attitude, avoiding exposing himself to open battles before having secured his position. This contrast in styles fueled the idea among their enemies that the Romans were cautious to the point of timidity, while in reality they were simply gaining time and consolidating their advantages. Frontinus, in his Stratagemata, recalls how Caesar was a master in the use of patience and simulation, inducing his opponent to make mistakes due to excess confidence. Reconnaissance was also crucial in the preparation phase. The legions had scouts and cavalry units responsible for mapping enemy movements and promptly reporting any changes in position. Cesare insists in his story on the speed with which he received news and on his ability to react in almost real time. This element, which might appear secondary to non-expert readers, actually represented a determining factor. A commander capable of anticipating the opponent, knowing his moves in advance, had an enormous advantage in a context of tribal wars where surprise and the unexpected were the order of the day. From a logistical point of view, Caesar had set up warehouses of grain and other food near the Remi, thus ensuring relatively safe supply lines. The construction of the bridge over the Axona not only made it possible to protect the Allied territory, but also guaranteed a stable corridor for the transit of foodstuffs. This aspect is mentioned in Bello Gallico, where the general describes how his troops prevented the Belgians from cutting the connections. Such attention to logistical details demonstrates that preparation was not limited to military deployment, but also included medium-term economic planning. While the Belgians concentrated their forces, Caesar continued to observe their movements, aware that such a large army could not have resisted for long without prey and without the possibility of devastating fertile territories. For this reason, the Roman commander decided to avoid direct confrontation until logistical and political pressure had begun to weaken the enemies. The construction of defensive works and the choice of a position protected by a river reflected this waiting strategy. It was not just a defensive tactic, but a way to transform time into a weapon. Every day that passed wore down the Belgian coalition and strengthened the Roman position. The preparation for the Battle of the Axona River was therefore characterized by a combination of factors: the choice of terrain, the fortification of the camp, the protection of supply lines, the collection of information, and the management of relations with the Allies. Unlike the campaigns against the Helvetii or against Ariovistus, in which speed and decision had been decisive, this time Caesar favored prudence and solidity of positions. It was not a question of hesitation, but of an accurate calculation based on the awareness of the numerical disproportion. The Roman commander's ability was revealed in transforming a condition of apparent inferiority into a strategic advantage, exploiting the discipline of his legions and the internal fragility of the enemy coalition. In 57 BC, the campaign that had brought Caesar and his legions to clash with the great Belgian coalition reached its climax along the course of the Axona River, today known as Aisne. The chronology of the battle cannot be reconstructed day by day with absolute precision, since our main sources consist above all of the second book of Bello Gallico, supplemented by later observations such as those of Frontinus in the Stratagemata and by fragments of minor authors. However, the general picture of the operations appears clear and allows us to understand the unfolding of events in sufficient detail. The Belgians, after having devastated part of the Remi territory and having attempted to weaken their resistance, had encamped in large numbers a short distance from the Roman camp. Caesar describes this massive mass of warriors as a multitude covering vast areas, with tents and temporary camps scattered haphazardly, while the Romans maintained their fortified camp according to customary military discipline. The first significant contact came through cavalry skirmishes. Rome's allied forces, made up of Remi and Aedui, repeatedly found themselves engaged in rapid clashes along the banks of the Axona, while the Belgian knights sought to test enemy resistance and explore any weak points in the Roman defenses. Caesar, as reported in Bello Gallico, decided not to immediately engage in a pitched battle, but ordered his light troops to strike with targeted actions and to withdraw quickly within the protection of the field. This seemingly prudent scheme of contact and retreat had the effect of consuming the energies of the Belgae and demonstrating the solidity of the Roman defenses. The greatest pressure was concentrated on the bridge built by the Romans over the Axona. The Belgians understood that controlling or destroying that passage would mean isolating Caesar from the rear and preventing the Romans from protecting the Remi. In one of the most significant episodes of the battle, a large enemy contingent attempted to cross the river at a less guarded point, with the intention of outflanking the Roman camp and devastating the allied villages on the other side. Caesar, informed in time by the scouts, sent Titus Labienus against them with legions ready to counter the movement. The sources recall how the reaction was rapid and decisive. The Romans managed not only to repel the assault, but also to inflict serious losses on the Belgians who had ventured onto the muddy banks of the river. This episode marked a turning point, as it highlighted the inability of the Belgians to effectively coordinate their movements. While part of the army attempted to outflank, the main body remained inactive or hesitant in front of the Roman fortified camp. Caesar carefully observed these signs of disorganization and took encouragement from them, convinced that the enemy coalition would not be able to withstand the logistical and moral pressure for long. In fact, as he himself points out in Bello Gallico, the Belgians soon found themselves short of supplies. Having flocked in large numbers, they had rapidly consumed the supplies they had brought with them and had not set up a stable supply system. This element, which was always a determining factor for Rome thanks to the organization of warehouses and transport lines, became a fatal weakness for the enemies. The direct clashes around the Roman camp were intense. On several occasions the Belgians attempted to attack the fortifications, but the ditches, embankments and palisades made every attack unsuccessful. Caesar reports waves of warriors advancing shouting and throwing projectiles, only to be repelled by the close order of the legions, the towers and the throwing machines that defended the camp walls. The Roman resistance, based on discipline and the intelligent use of defensive structures, demonstrated how difficult it was for a tribal army, without sophisticated siege techniques, to break an army accustomed to operating as a single military machine. The next phase was marked by the progressive moral attrition of the Belgians. Every day that passed without tangible victories increased the discontent among the various tribes, who began to distrust each other and fear for the fate of their distant villages. Caesar points out that many warriors were farmers and that prolonged absence from the fields could have compromised the harvests. The awareness of not being able to keep such a large army away from their lands for long contributed to the decision to abandon the siege and disperse the forces. This withdrawal, however, did not take place in an orderly manner. The coalition, lacking a unified leadership, began to disintegrate with each tribe returning to its own territory. Caesar took the opportunity to inflict an even heavier blow. His legions pursued the retreating Belgians, attacking the rearguards and inflicting significant casualties. This pursuit demonstrated the operational superiority of the Romans, capable of quickly moving from a static defense to an offensive maneuver. Frontinus recalls how Caesar's skill also consisted in knowing how to wait for the right moment to transform patience into decisive action, catching his enemies at the moment of maximum weakness. The epilogue of the battle saw the complete dissolution of the coalition. Many peoples who had joined the Great Alliance, seeing the lack of success and fearing Roman reprisal, sent ambassadors to Caesar to ask for clemency and offer hostages. This result, more than a simple military victory, constituted a far-reaching political success. Rome had not only repelled the Belgian assault, but had demonstrated its ability to protect allies and break large-scale organized resistance. The consequences of the Battle of Axona were notable. From a military point of view, Caesar consolidated his position in northern Gaul, ensuring the loyalty of the Remi and weakening the offensive capacity of the Belgians. From a political point of view, the episode strengthened the image of the Roman general as an invincible leader, capable of facing numerically overwhelming forces with intelligence and discipline. From a psychological point of view, The defeat undermined the confidence of the Gallic tribes in the possibility of opposing Rome with improvised and numerous but lacking cohesion coalitions. Later sources recall this episode as an example of Roman organizational superiority. Tacitus, although writing more than a century later, underlined how Roman military virtues did not consist only in individual courage, but in the collective discipline that transformed the army into an instrument capable of resisting enormous pressures. The Battle of Axona was cited in military manuals as an example of how a commander could exploit terrain, logistics, and time to overturn a numerical disadvantage. The reasons for the Roman victory can be summarized in Caesar's ability to choose favorable terrain, to quickly fortify his positions, to protect supply lines, and to exploit the internal weaknesses of the enemy coalition. The reasons for the Belgian defeat lie in the lack of unity, in the inability to maintain such a large army for a long time without an adequate logistical system, and in the underestimation of Roman defensive capabilities. In conclusion, the Battle of the Axona River was not just an armed clash, but a crucial step in the progressive submission of Gaul to Rome. The victory strengthened the legion's confidence and consolidated Caesar's authority, paving the way for subsequent campaigns that would lead to the complete conquest of Gallic territory. The episode demonstrated in an exemplary way how Roman power did not depend exclusively on the number of soldiers, but on discipline, planning, and the ability to transform every circumstance into an advantage. For this reason, the Battle of Axona remained in the memory as one of the moments in which the superiority of the Roman method clearly emerged in the face of an enemy coalition which, although impressive in numbers, was unable to stand the test of time and organized warfare.